Hello and welcome everyone to this second part of the Randomized Dungeon Dev Talks. In the last video, we talked a little bit about what the Randomized Dungeons are, how they play, and this sort of thing. And in today's video, I want to focus on answering the specific questions that you had after the video and that you've had for a while now. Specifically, I want to talk about questions regarding PvP and your generalized gameplay questions. So without further ado, let's jump straight into your questions regarding PvP in the Randomized Dungeons. The answer to that is pretty simple. It depends on the zone you found the Randomized Dungeon in. So if you're in a safe zone, the Randomized Dungeon will have safe zone rules. If you're entering it from a black zone, it'll have black zone rules. So the randomized dungeons that we're spawning now with the Oberon update will only have a single entrance. And this is due to the fact that we want to be spawning as many as possible as we can of these, and that we really want them to have a focused PvE experience where you can just play the dungeon through in one go, and we don't want it to branch into too many directions. Yes, we want the randomized dungeons to feel pretty much like any other dungeon in the open world, and we really don't want you to have to walk back multiple levels of dungeon after you've cleared it. So teleporting out of them is available as it is with any other open world dungeon. The answer is it kind of depends on the dungeon you've found. On average, it'll take between 15 to 40 minutes, depending on the depth that you've found. 40 minutes should be the exception, but there is quite some variety there. I'm assuming you're referring to black market loot items. We've actually made a change with the Oberon update when it comes to black market loot. It used to be that you can only find up to the tier of the dungeon that you're playing. And we found that this was a bit frustrating because oftentimes you would be finding gear that was tiered below the gear that you were using to clear the dungeon. So the change that we made is that now you can find up to two tiers above the tier of the dungeon. So you now have a bigger range of items that you can find, and it should be a much more rewarding experience. We built a shrine feature to provide any kind of benefit to the players. We can choose any kind of spell effect, and we playtested quite a few of them. We actually had quite a few combat buffs in there during playtesting, but we found that they were never really rewarding enough for the players. The players always were disappointed that they didn't find a chest instead of the shrine, because the combat buff didn't really feel like it made such a huge difference. And obviously, if we had turned it up to crazy values, it would become a high PvP risk. So we found that what works best and what's now in the Oberon update for the shrines are buffs to your fame gain and to your silver gain. So basically, when you find one of these shrines, you're really encouraged to make the best of the buff that you've received, and you kind of start this race to kill as many mobs as you can and to get the highest reward as you can in the short time that the buff runs. Yes, if there's no players in them anymore. So the rule how the dungeons close is that once you enter them, you start a lifetime timer for the dungeon. And once that timer has run out, the dungeon can close. However, it will not close whilst there are players inside, and it will not close immediately after the last player leaves, but instead there's a short window in which the dungeon still stays up in case you left by accident or someone else wants to follow you into it. A map basically causes a dungeon to spawn for you if you're using it in the proximity, at least, of an appropriate zone. You don't need to be exactly in a tier 6 zone to use a tier 6 map, but you need to be nearby a tier 6 zone to use it. And it's important to note that the Caerleon portal doesn't work for that, so you need to be in the Outlands to be spawning a map dungeon in the Outlands. First, we need to clarify something. A map doesn't help you find a dungeon of a higher tier than you would typically find in that zone. What the map can help you with is finding an enchanted version of a dungeon. So you basically, if you're in a T6 zone and you use a T6 map, you'll find a tier 6 dungeon, but it may be an enchanted dungeon based on the map. So it'll have higher rewards and higher challenge, higher increased value basically. But it will still require, for example, the tier 6 Reaver bonus to defeat. It won't have tier 8 mobs inside. So in particular, when it comes to the hardcore expeditions, of course, randomized dungeons have the advantage of availability. For hardcore expedition, you need a token. Randomized dungeons should be available all over the world, so you can kind of just go and play them. In addition, they will have the full benefits of the zone's challenge multipliers, the PvP value multipliers, so increased fame, increased silver, increased loot. And with that, we've reached the end of the questions that we had for today. I want to take this moment, however, to kind of sum up the direction of the questions and maybe give you a little bit more background on why we decided to design the dungeons this way, and also what you can expect us to do in the future. So a lot of you had questions on PvP, and it shows us that you're really concerned about the risk of PvP in the randomized dungeons, or you would really like PvP to happen inside of the randomized dungeons. You're looking for more opportunities for PvP. For those, I can say, unfortunately, the randomized dungeons are not the place where we envision massive amounts of PvP happening. Ideally, they should be relatively safe, however, always carry the risk of a random encounter, as the open world always does. But if the randomized dungeons become too much of a death trap or too dangerous to play, then we've missed our goal, and we will need to take additional steps to make them work better for open world PvE groups, because they're supposed to be our baseline open world PvE, and if that is too dangerous to play for average groups, then really there isn't a whole lot to do for average groups in the open world. The second bit of questions had to do with the exact way that they play. And I hope I've given you a lot of answers that make it a bit more clear of how they play, but of course there's no better way than to find out how they play by playing them than playing them yourself. So jump on the test server and try them out. Send us your feedback on how you feel they play, whether you find that we've met our balancing goals in making them as rewarding as they need to be to offset the risk of the open world, and so on. I want to give you a bit of an idea of how these fit into our long-term plan for Albion Online. The randomized dungeons are part of what we would call the first layer, the baseline layer of activities. And we really think that this establishes that layer finally in the open world. This first layer consists of activities that you should be able to do anytime. And it's basically something that ensures that anytime you log into Albion Online, you have something meaningful to do, something that gets you forward. After we properly established this first layer or updated it with the launch of the randomized dungeons and the extension with the solo version of that, we are likely to focus on the second layer. And the second layer is comprised of activities that bring players together, that don't necessarily want to be brought together, or that are looking for encounters, PvP encounters with other players. This layer includes activities like treasure chests, castles, guardians, all sorts of world bosses, all sorts of rare content that is pre-announced, so that players have a chance to be there when something happens, and you can expect PvP to happen. We have this layer of activity, but we really think it can be improved, and it will probably be the focus of improvement quite soon. And we think there's a lot that we can do on this sort of level with activities. So if you're disappointed with the fact that Randomized Dungeons don't offer too much in terms of PvP, rest assured that we are aware that we want to be pushing dedicated sort of PvP experiences in the open world, and significantly improving the types of experiences that we have there. To complete this understanding of how we view activities, it's also maybe worth mentioning the third layer of activities, and that is what I would call strategic activities. This is the sort of guild level activities like territory control, GVG, where you can't really rely on it to deliver content, because whether it's active or not depends heavily on the situation of your guild. And the strategic situation, whether you're at peace or at war and so on. And this layer, of course, we're also working on, and there will be a big update regarding our plans there with the release of Oberon. So you can expect to hear more on our overall vision when Oberon goes live. But this gives you an idea of how we're thinking about the layers of the world and what layers we want to focus on next. I hope this dev talk was enlightening for you, and I really hope you enjoy the Randomized Dungeon when Oberon launches on March 20th. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.